In the middle of horror, a camera shutter cut through the screams. It wasn't a family portrait. It was propaganda. But in that fraction of a second, a life changed. Among millions condemned, one child was chosen. Not for her innocence, not for her smile, but for her usefulness. And so, a photograph saved a little girl from the Holocaust. In this picture, she looks as if she's simply posing. But behind those eyes was the miracle of survival. Her name was Hana Weiss. She was born in 1935 in a quiet town in Slovakia, the second child of Samuel and Miriam Weiss. Her father worked as a shoemaker, spending long hours hunched over scraps of leather, his hands scarred but steady, his pride resting in the shoes he made for neighbors. Her mother was a seamstress, working tirelessly with thread and cloth to mend dresses and trousers, her sewing machine clattering late into the night. Together, they raised Hana and her older brother, David, in a home filled with ordinary rhythms. The smell of fresh bread baking, the sound of rain against the roof, the warmth of Sabbath candles glowing on Friday nights. Hana was lively, curious, and imaginative. She loved to sit at the table with chalk, pretending to be a school teacher, while David played the role of the stubborn student who never learned his lessons. She skipped stones by the river, sang with her mother while folding laundry, and pressed her hands against frosted windows in winter to draw little shapes with her fingers. She was a child in every sense of the word, full of promise, unaware of how fragile childhood can be. The first signs of change came slowly. In 1939, as Slovakia aligned itself with Nazi Germany, Jewish families like the Weiss family began to notice doors closing. At first, it was subtle. Neighbors who stopped greeting them on the street. Teachers who no longer smiled at Hana's father when he dropped off his shoes for repair. Then it became law. Jewish shops were confiscated. Synagogues were shuttered. Hana, still only 4, felt it in ways she could not explain. The sudden silence when adults whispered about new decrees. The look of fear in her mother's eyes when soldiers marched past. By the time she turned 9, Hana had been expelled from school. Her father's shop no longer belonged to him. The friends she once played with now avoided her, as if she carried a sickness. Childhood had ended before she could even define it. Life in the ghetto was a different kind of prison. Families were forced into overcrowded apartments where damp walls seemed to close in tighter each night. Hunger lingered everywhere. Bread was sliced thinner and thinner until the pieces resembled scraps of cloth. Soup was stretched so far it was no more than cloudy water. Hana's mother tried to disguise the hunger with lullabies at night, whispering the same song she once sang in happier times. But no song could mask the sound of boots in the morning or the sight of neighbors dragged into trucks. It was on one of those gray mornings that Hana's fate was decided, not by choice, not by justice, but by a camera. Soldiers stormed the ghetto, ordering families into the central square. Hana clung desperately to her mother's hand as she was pushed into the crowd of crying children and praying adults. An officer raised a camera, and suddenly the purpose of the roundup shifted. The Nazis wanted photographs, images to send to the outside world as proof that Jews were being treated humanely. They needed children who looked healthy, smiling, alive. The officer's eyes swept the crowd and stopped on Hana. He pointed sharply. "Do! Higher! You! Here!" Her heart froze. She was shoved forward, separated from her mother's hand, and placed in front of the camera. The officer barked one more word. "Smile." Her mother leaned down and whispered urgently, "Do what they say, Hana. Please." So Hana forced her lips upward. The shutter clicked. In that moment, her life changed. That night, trucks filled with children left the ghetto. Hundreds disappeared, their cries echoing as the engines roared. But Hana remained, not because she was rescued, not because she was shown mercy, but because her photograph had already been taken. From that moment on, Hana lived on borrowed time. She was occasionally pulled aside, cleaned up, and shown to visitors. Officials pointed to her picture as evidence that children were cared for. She became an unwilling prop in the theater of lies. To Hana, nothing made sense. "Why me?" she asked her mother. Miriam stroked her hair and whispered, "Because they need your face. Because for some reason, they chose you." The truth was harsher. The photograph had bought her a few days, maybe weeks. No more. But those days mattered. Every dawn meant she was still alive. Every breath was defiance against a system built to erase her. The reprieve ended when the ghetto was liquidated. Hana, her parents, and David were herded into cattle cars. The doors slammed shut, trapping them in darkness. The stench of fear, sweat, and waste suffocated the air. Children cried until no sound came. Mothers tried to soothe them with whispers. Fathers tried to shield them with their arms. Hana leaned against her mother, who sang softly, her voice trembling as she disguised sobs with lullabies. After days of suffocating travel, the doors opened. Smoke, barking dogs, and shouted orders filled the air. They had arrived at Auschwitz. Men were separated from women, children torn away in chaos. Whips cracked, boots thundered, and confusion reigned. Hana felt her father's arms slip from her as guards shoved him to one side. Her mother's hand was pulled from hers. Then a guard stopped. He stared at Hana's face, recognition flickering in his eyes. "That's the girl from the photo," he muttered. Once again, the image overruled the gas chamber. While thousands were marched to death that day, Hana was pulled aside. She became, once again, the face of a lie. Life in Auschwitz was a nightmare of repetition. Roll calls at dawn, endless labor, the gnawing ache of hunger, the bitter cold that cut through thin uniforms. But Hana's days were different. She was fed slightly more to keep her cheeks round, her hair brushed so she could appear healthy. She was displayed, occasionally photographed again. Behind the staged smiles, she saw everything: the endless smoke, the ash that drifted like snow, the barracks that emptied overnight. At 9 years old, Hana carried the unbearable truth. She was alive not because she mattered, but because her face was useful. In January 1945, the lie finally collapsed. The Red Army advanced, guards fled, and the gates of Auschwitz opened. Hana staggered out, barely recognizable. Skin and bones, eyes too large for her face. Her mother was gone. Her father was gone. Only she and her brother David survived. They were children, but they walked out carrying the weight of an entire family's memory. For decades, Hana remained silent. She emigrated to America, married, had children of her own. She baked bread in her kitchen, tended her garden, attended synagogue services. On the surface, her life seemed ordinary again. But every time a camera clicked, she froze. Her life had once depended on that sound, and guilt gnawed at her. Why her? Why not the other children who had smiled and never returned? She had no answer, so she stayed quiet. Silence held until the 1980s, when historians uncovered a box of photographs taken for Nazi propaganda. Among them was Hana's image, a little girl with braids, a forced smile, and eyes that carried the weight of fear. The photograph was displayed in museums, printed in books, studied in classrooms. Visitors leaned close to the glass, whispering about the little girl. Teachers told students she had surely perished. Survivors wept quietly before her picture. Then came the revelation. Hana was alive. The little girl in the photograph had grown into a woman, a mother, a grandmother. The propaganda image was no longer just a tool of lies. It had become testimony. Hana began to speak. She traveled to schools, universities, and community centers. Holding the photo in her hands, she told her story. "They used this image to lie. Now I use it to tell the truth." Her voice trembled, but her words cut deep. She explained how her survival had not been bravery, but utility, and how the same photograph, decades later, had become her weapon against forgetting. Students leaned forward in silence. Children whispered, "She lived because of a picture." Survivors nodded, tears in their eyes, and Hana always ended with the same words: "I didn't survive because I was strong. I survived because, for a moment, I was useful. But survival without meaning is empty. So I tell my story to give it meaning." The photograph that once served lies had become proof, a face that spoke louder than denial, a voice that refused to fade. In that single photograph, time stood still, but life moved forward. What was once propaganda became memory. What was once silence became voice. What was once a lie became truth. Today, when we look at that picture, we understand. A child lived, not because the Nazis had mercy, but because a camera captured her smile. That smile, forced in terror, now speaks louder than guns, louder than hate, louder than silence. If Hana's story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Voices from the Camps. Share this video. Comment below. I will remember Hana, because as long as we remember her, forgetting will never win.